The HOA accused me of violating contemporary neighborhood standards. All I was doing was feeding chickens on land that's been in my family longer than microwave ovens have existed. Evidently, rooster crows now qualify as national crises, especially if you live next to someone with a high-end SUV and zero grasp of irony. I didn't challenge them at first. I watched them bury themselves in a pile of bylaws and jargon, all while sitting inside a building that, spoiler alert, might not legally belong to them. If you enjoy tales of petty authority, property rights drama, and one unassuming rancher with more cards than he shows, get your coffee ready. Things are about to get personal, legal, and a little poetic. It was just past 6 a.m. on a Tuesday when I first crossed paths with Whitney Hail. I was out with my chickens, enjoying the peace of another crisp morning on a ranch that's been ours for 3 generations. The roosters were crowing, the sky was glowing, and the world felt quiet until I heard the sharp, out-of-place click of high heels on gravel. Let me set the scene. This is a working ranch. Dirt paths, hay strewn about, and the occasional muddy patch thanks to the sprinklers. So when I turned to see a woman strutting toward me in gleaming white pantsuit and designer heels, I knew this wasn't going to be a neighborly visit. Whitney Hail was the walking embodiment of someone who'd lived here for 6 months and already decided the world needed her leadership. She had that unwavering confidence of a person who's never heard no, dressed in an outfit that screamed, "I paid more for this handbag than you did for your last 2 grocery trips." Her blonde hair was pulled into what I later learned was called a power bob, and she carried a leather portfolio that matched her shoes. It might have made an impression in a city boardroom, but here with my chickens pecking at her heels, she looked about as natural as a shark in a sandbox. "Are you gay, Walker?" she asked, her voice laced with the kind of nasal sharpness that signals someone used to dominating every conversation. I nodded, setting down my feed bucket and wiping my hands off on my jeans. "I'm Whitney Hail, president of the Meadowbrook Community Homeowners Association. I'm here on official business." She opened her sleek portfolio like it contained sacred scrolls and pulled out a document, holding it toward me like an eviction spell. "This is an official HOA violation notice. Your property is in breach of multiple community standards." I took the paper from her carefully manicured fingers and started to read. The notice listed complaints: agricultural odors, noise disturbances from farm animals, and land use deemed inconsistent with the neighborhood's visual harmony. Stamped in elegant script was the Meadowbrook HOA's name, followed by Whitney's signature, her title styled as President and Director of Community Standards. I had to hand it to her. She'd climbed the ladder fast in 6 months. "Mrs. Hail," I said evenly, "this ranch has stood here since 1947. The neighborhood came up around us, not the other way around." She shifted her weight, and I noticed one of her heels sink into the soft ground by the chicken coop. "That may be so, Mr. Walker," she said coolly, "but times evolve. We're responsible for upholding standards that preserve property values and offer a modern lifestyle to all residents." The way she said modern lifestyle made it sound like my chickens were some ancient plague. I watched her wrestle her heel out of the dirt, all while trying to maintain dignity, and I won't lie, it was a bit entertaining. "You have 30 days to address the violations," she continued, finally freeing her shoe with a soft pop, leaving behind a neat stiletto print in the mud. "I trust you'll handle this properly." With that, she turned and made her way back to her spotless white BMW, her steps much more cautious now. I stood there, violation notice in hand, watching her drive off. For the first time in years, I felt something rise up in me, a stubborn fire I hadn't felt since Grandpa passed. The urge to defend what was rightfully ours. After she disappeared down the road, I headed straight for the barn, where Grandpa kept his office. I hadn't touched the filing cabinet in months, but I knew what I was after. Wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine, and tucked inside were the original deeds and land records. Everything from the 1962 purchase by Grandpa Morrison. As I unrolled them across the workbench, I couldn't help but grin. Whitney Hail had no clue what kind of hornet's nest she'd just kicked. You ever hear the saying about the quiet ones? We're usually the ones with the best prepared plans. 3 days after the notice arrived, I got a call from Eleanor Whippy, a longtime neighbor and friend who's lived here since 1968. Gay. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice sugar-sweet with a flicker of mischief. "Whitney's called an emergency. Oh, a meeting tonight. Got herself a whole slideshow on what she's calling the ranch problem." Eleanor, who used to be a court clerk back when Grandpa was scooping up acreage, always looked out for us. "Thought you might want to attend," she added before hanging up. That evening, I cleaned up and drove over to the Meadowbrook Community Center, a building that, funnily enough, sits on land the Morrison Trust has been leasing to the HOA since 2018. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked into a meeting meant to oust me, held on property we technically owned. Inside, around 20 residents had gathered, most of them familiar faces. Rick Davenport, who's been secretly buying fresh eggs from me for 2 years, offered a sheepish nod from across the room. Whitney had turned the front of the room into a full-on corporate presentation space. A projector, laptop, color-coded slides. She was dressed in another power suit, navy this time, probably worth a small fortune. Her husband Preston stood beside her, sharp in his tailored suit and gold. Watch, I'd heard he had political ambitions, and it was clear he saw this upscale neighborhood as his launchpad. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Whitney began, clicking her laser pointer with the precision of someone running a quarterly earnings call. "Tonight, we're here to address a pressing concern that impacts the value of every property in our community." The first slide lit up. Meadowbrook 2020, a vision for luxury living. She'd clearly invested time in this, complete with pie charts and glossy visuals. "As our market analysis shows," she continued, "agricultural operations within residential zones tend to lower surrounding home values by 15 to 20%. Preston rose to add the legal weight behind the campaign. He knew how to command a room. "The Homeowners Association has both the authority and the obligation to uphold community standards," he said with the gravity of a closing argument. "We have legal recourse for non-compliant land use, and we are prepared to use it if resolution isn't reached." The phrase legal recourse hung in the air like a warning shot. This was no longer a discussion, it was a declaration. That's when Eleanor Whitby, seated in the back like a calm storm, raised her hand. At 67, Eleanor had witnessed Meadowbrook's transformation from open fields to manicured lawns. She wasn't the type to be rattled by flashy graphs or veiled threats. "Whitney, darling," she said sweetly, her smile the kind that usually signaled mischief. "Do you happen to know who actually owns the land beneath this building?" Whitney's pointer trembled slightly. Preston shot her a side glance, the kind that said we didn't prep for this question. Before Whitney could cobble together a response, 8-year-old Tommy Chun lifted his hand from the front row, where he sat between his parents. Tommy had been a regular visitor to my ranch, always eager to help feed the hens. "Mr. Gray teaches me how to take care of animals," he said in the kind of pure, unwavering voice only a child can manage. "How is that a bad thing?" A hush swept through the room. Whitney opened her mouth, then closed it again. No pie chart could counter a child's honesty. In that moment, Tommy did more damage to her campaign than any legal strategy ever could. I stood slowly, every pair of eyes landing on me. Dressed in my usual jeans and a faded work shirt, I was a stark contrast to Whitney's PowerPoint empire. "I appreciate that people care about the community," I said, steady and respectful. "I've lived here my entire life. I know how important it is that neighbors work together." I let my words hang for a beat, meeting familiar gazes around the room. "I'll absolutely consider what's best for our community going forward. To some, it may have sounded like concession. But Eleanor caught the emphasis our end. Her knowing smile returned. The meeting ended with Whitney assigning a compliance team to observe and report on my ranch operations and scheduling a follow-up meeting in a month. As people filtered out, Rick Davenport avoided my eyes entirely. A few neighbors mumbled polite goodnights, but the shift was clear. Lines were being drawn, and mine wasn't exactly crowded. I lingered until the room was empty, then approached Whitney as she packed up her laptop and handouts, with the satisfaction of someone who believed she'd just scored a victory. That was a solid presentation, I told her genuinely. You clearly put in the work. She blinked, caught off guard. I don't think she expected her adversary to offer a compliment. Thank you, she said, her tone softening. I really do want what's best for everyone. For a brief second, I saw past the designer wardrobe and corporate polish to someone who genuinely thought she was doing right. Almost made me feel bad for what was coming. Almost. Back at my truck, I pulled out my phone and hit a familiar contact. Sam, it's time. I need every land record from 1960 to now. If they wanted to play legal games, I'd show them what the rulebook actually said. The next morning, I had another visit. But this time, Whitney didn't come alone. She brought a full entourage, like a legal task force descending on a crime scene. There she was, dressed in yet another high-end outfit. Preston flanked her, briefcase in hand. Behind them came a professional photographer and a land use specialist with a laser measurer and clipboard. They wanted this to feel official, intimidating, surgical. Mr. Walker, Whitney announced, voice sharpened with authority. We're here for a formal compliance inspection under HOA guidelines. She handed over a thick document twice the size of the last notice. This outlines all violations that must be addressed within 30 days, or legal action will be pursued. She said legal action like she expected to personally drag me to court. Judging by Preston's smug expression, that might have been the plan. I sipped from my coffee mug and leaned on the porch post, watching the show unfold. The photographer snapped shots of everything: the chicken coops, the faded barn, even my hand-painted fresh egg sign by the road. The land use specialist wandered with his tools, jotting down figures like he was mapping out a military base. Whitney oversaw the scene like a field commander, pointing out supposed violations for documentation. I need an explanation for the unauthorized commercial activity occurring on residential land, Preston said, his voice cool and calculated. He gestured toward the little produce stand where neighbors picked up eggs or the occasional basket of vegetables. Running a business here without proper zoning and permits is a direct violation of both HOA regulations and county statutes. I watched the press conference unfold from just outside the community center's side door, out of sight but well within earshot. I didn't need to be front and center to feel the weight of Whitney's words. The sheer gall of it using our family's own building to stage a public relations campaign against us. Against me. As Whitney wrapped up her remarks with a dramatic appeal to protect the future of Meadowbrook, I slipped inside through the rear hallway, unnoticed. Cheryl Hawthorne was furiously typing into her laptop, between bursts of camera flashes. Preston stood off to the side, arms crossed, nodding like a man who believed his case had just been won by a well-delivered monologue. Whitney looked radiant in her triumph, polished, poised, and perfectly wrong. I waited until the polite applause began to fade, then walked calmly down the side aisle toward the podium. A few heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Cheryl lowered her camera as I approached. Mind if I say a few words? I asked, though I was already stepping up beside Whitney. She hesitated for a beat, clearly weighing whether to stop me, but the optics of denying someone the microphone in a community forum must have given her pause. She stepped aside, stiff smile frozen in place. I looked out at the small crowd mostly. The same people from the meeting weeks before, neighbors, old classmates, people who had eaten my grandmother's sweet corn at summer potlucks and helped raise the barn that Whitney now called an eyesore. "Thank you for coming," I began, echoing Whitney's opening, though my tone was far less polished. "I appreciate your time. I know there's been a lot said about what's happening at my ranch, and I'd like to offer some facts just so everyone can make up their own minds." I pulled a folder from my coat and held it up. This is the full Morrison Trust file. Property deeds, zoning maps, tax records, and a 99-year lease agreement that predates the formation of this HOA. My family didn't just move in, we helped build this community, quite literally. And the land my ranch sits on? It was never formally annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction. That got a reaction. Even Cheryl's fingers paused above her keys. "I've submitted this documentation to the county for verification," I continued. "And I've retained counsel to ensure our rights are protected moving forward." Whitney stepped back up beside me, trying to recover control. "Regardless of technicalities, this is about maintaining the character and standards of our neighborhood. Surely we can agree that—" "I think we can agree," I interrupted gently, "that families raising their kids with hands-on experiences, learning where food comes from, and understanding responsibility that is part of our communities. Character, or at least it used to be." There was a long pause. I let it hang. "I'm not running a factory. I'm not putting in a piggery or a commercial cannery. I'm selling eggs from chickens my grandfather raised and letting neighborhood kids learn about animals because some things matter more than home values on a spreadsheet." Cheryl lowered her camera again and looked at me in a new way, less like a target and more like a story she hadn't fully understood until now. "I'm not trying to divide this neighborhood. But I also won't be bullied into pretending that history and humanity don't matter." I stepped back from the podium. For a moment, there was silence. Then Eleanor, sitting halfway back, with a half-eaten cookie in her lap, clapped once, then again. A few others joined in, hesitant, then more certain. Not thunderous applause, but enough to know that not everyone had bought into Whitney's narrative. Whitney's face remained frozen in that perfect smile, but her eyes were already scanning for an exit strategy. Preston looked less confident, now his attorney's veneer cracking ever so slightly under the weight of facts they hadn't expected to face in public. As I walked out into the cool air, I called Sam. "Get everything ready," I told him. "The press conference gave us exactly what we needed. We go public next week, history, legal standing, the whole truth. Let's give Meadowbrook something real to talk about." Because if Whitney wanted a war, she was about to learn what it meant to fight someone with deep roots and nothing left to lose. Preston's legal delivery was practically a performance, full of references to property statutes, zoning infractions, and the HOA's duty to uphold neighborhood investments. He tossed around terms like class action exposure and precedent setting, litigation, as if my modest chicken coop posed a national threat to suburban peace. The man clearly missed his calling as a senator. He had a knack for inflating small neighborhood squabbles into matters of constitutional significance. By the time Whitney was wrapping up her final remarks, I had just parked my truck and caught the tail end, her promising to pursue all legal avenues to uphold community integrity. As the crowd filed out, most people avoided looking in my direction. A few gave hesitant, unsure nods, the kind people offer when they don't want to pick a side. Rick Davenport nearly ran to his car, pretending not to see me, despite having bought my eggs every week while loudly supporting Whitney's crusade. 3 days later, things hit a tipping point. Cheryl Hawthorne published a blog post with the headline, "Local Rancher Disrupts Neighborhood Harmony." The article portrayed me as some cranky recluse, stuck in the past and defying progress. She regurgitated Whitney's talking points and added her own flair, painting me as the lone obstacle to modernization. The comments section was a mess. of opinions from strangers who'd never stepped foot on my land, calling me everything from outdated to obstructive, with plenty of folks suggesting I find somewhere more suitable to live. I sat at the kitchen table rereading it all, a heat building in my chest that hadn't flared in years. Not just irritation, real, smoldering anger, the kind you feel when someone attacks your legacy and your values. I shut the laptop and walked to my grandfather's desk. In the bottom drawer, beneath the same oilcloth that had once held the deed, was a letter he'd written me long before he passed. Gray, it began in that careful, looping handwriting. If anyone ever tries to take this land from us, remember, we hold more power than they realize. Defend what matters. Don't be silenced by noise. I placed the letter back gently and grabbed my phone. Sam, I need you here in the morning. Bring everything. It's time. I'll admit what I did. Next was a little dramatic, maybe even petty. But sometimes you let people believe they've won, just long enough to make the truth hit harder. 3 days after Cheryl's article dropped, I called Whitney directly and asked her to schedule a follow-up HOA meeting. I want to address everyone's concerns, I said, sounding cooperative, even slightly defeated. We need a solution that works for all of us. She could hardly hide her glee when she announced the meeting for Thursday night. The crowd packed in again, buzzing with the expectation of resolution. Judging by the murmurs and eager faces, most assumed I was ready to cave. This time, I dressed the part-creased khakis, clean button-up, even combed my hair. I looked like a man ready to assimilate into the tidy suburban mold Whitney had championed. When I stood to speak, I struck a contrite pose, keeping my tone just soft enough to suggest resignation. Thank you for coming, I began. I've spent a lot of time reflecting these past weeks, and I think maybe it's time for a change. I caught Whitney beaming, positively glowing with satisfaction. Preston leaned forward, nodding with the pride of a mentor watching his pupil learn. After reviewing everyone's concerns about property values and neighborhood expectations, I continued, I've decided it's time to sell the ranch. The room buzzed with gasps and relieved sighs. Some people looked stunned, others visibly relaxed. Even my friendlier neighbors seemed grateful the dispute was over. Rick Davenport, ever the opportunist, cracked a grin, no doubt already imagining the bump in his home appraisal. And then Sam Granger entered the room. For 15 years he'd served as legal counsel to the Morrison Trust, and he looked every bit the part in a sharp suit and polished shoes. He carried a briefcase and a projector bag, his calm presence a sharp contrast to the tension in the room. But before I finalize anything, I continued, keeping one eye on Sam as he set up his gear, I thought everyone deserved to see what exactly is on the table. The projector flickered to life and cast the first slide onto the wall. Behind me, Morrison Trust Property Holdings, Meadowbrook Overview. Whitney's confident grin slipped slightly. This wasn't a concession. This was a presentation. Sam moved to the next slide, a detailed 1962 plat map of the entire neighborhood streets. Plots, cul-de-sacs, all outlined in red and labeled as Morrison Trust Holdings. Ladies and gentlemen, he began in his even, deliberate tone, let's review some important facts regarding land ownership in this community. Preston stood immediately, sensing trouble. We'll need to verify those documents, he said, his voice sharp with legal challenge. Historical property data is often ambiguous. I'll need proof before you continue. Sam just smiled, a calm, practiced lawyer's smile. Of course, he said smoothly. I've brought complete documentation, original deeds recorded, surveys, chain of title records, all notarized and filed with the county. He clicked again, photocopies of the original deeds appeared, dates and stamps in full view. As of this meeting, the Morrison Trust retains ownership of 847 acres in Meadowbrook, including the land beneath most of your homes. At that moment, Eleanor Whitby stood from her usual back row seat. That's correct, she said clearly, her voice full of authority. I was a clerk at the courthouse when this land was sold. I watched every document get filed. I remember it because it was the largest single transaction our county had seen that year. The silence that followed was thick. The residents' 20-some people who had just been celebrating my departure now sat motionless, processing a truth that changed everything. Whitney was frozen in place, her face pale as the projection behind me. The story she'd built so carefully about order, standards, and modern living was now unraveling under the weight of reality. Preston's legal performance was nothing short of theatrical complete, with dramatic references to property law, zoning codes, and the HOA's fiduciary duty to preserve homeowner investments. He tossed around phrases like class action potential and legal precedent, as though my chicken coop was a constitutional crisis in disguise. The man clearly missed his calling as a politician. He had that rare talent for inflating minor neighborhood squabbles into matters of national significance. By the time Whitney wrapped up her carefully worded speech, I was already parked in my truck, having arrived just in time to hear her final vow to pursue all legal avenues to uphold community standards. As the crowd filed out, most avoided my eyes. A few offered those awkward neutral nods people give when they don't know what side they're on. Rick Davenport practically sprinted to his SUV to avoid facing me, even though he'd been buying my eggs weekly while publicly backing Whitney's crusade. 3 days later, the tipping point arrived in the form of Cheryl Hawthorne's blog post. The headline, "Local Ranch Threatens Community Harmony." The article read like a press release from Whitney's playbook, accusing me of stubbornly resisting modernity and prioritizing livestock over neighborly peace. Cheryl even added her own editorial flair, waxing poetic about progress, tradition, and one man's refusal to compromise. The comment section filled quickly with armchair critics, most of whom had never set foot near my ranch, labeling me backward, selfish, or suggesting I move somewhere more appropriate. I sat at my kitchen table, reading and rereading the post, feeling something I hadn't in years, a deep, righteous anger. Not irritation, not frustration. Real, full-bodied fury, the kind that only comes when your family's legacy is attacked. I closed the laptop and walked to my grandfather's old desk. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in the same oilcloth that once held the property deeds, was a letter he wrote me long before he passed. Gray, it read in his careful hand. If anyone ever tries to take this land from our family, remember, we own more than they think. Protect what matters, don't get pushed around by noise. I folded the letter, placed it back, and picked up my phone. Sam, I need you here tomorrow. Bring everything. It's time. I won't claim what I did next was mature. But sometimes you let people think they've won, just long enough for them to realize how wrong they are. 3 days after Cheryl's article went live, I called Whitney. I kept my voice calm, almost defeated. I'd like to address everyone's concerns, I said. It's time we found a solution that works for everybody. She could barely hide her glee. When the meeting convened that Thursday evening, Whitney practically bounced to the front of the room, ready to bask in victory. The community room was packed, but this time, the mood was expectant. People wanted closure, and most thought that meant me surrendering, removing the coop, and falling in line. I dressed differently too, no ranch clothes. Just khakis and a pressed button down, the image of reluctant compliance. When I stood, I even looked a little sheepish, like a man who knew he was beaten. Thank you all for being here, I began, letting a sigh linger. I've done a lot of thinking. Maybe it's time for some changes. Whitney beamed, soaking in her imagined win. Preston nodded like a proud teacher. Considering your concerns about property values and neighborhood standards, I've decided to sell the ranch. Gasps, murmurs, a few relieved smiles, some actually clapped. Whitney looked like she'd won the Super Bowl. Even my former allies seemed cautiously pleased, happy the feud was ending. That's when Sam Granger entered. He wore his tailored suit like armor, carrying a laptop and a professional-grade projector. The room shifted. Interest peaked. But before I finalize any decisions, I continued, watching Sam set up, I thought everyone should know what they're actually getting. The projector lit up, casting a title slide across the wall. Morrison Trust Property Holdings. Meadowbrook Community Overview. Whitney's smile faltered. Sam clicked to the next slide. A map of Meadowbrook from 1962. Each lot outlined and labeled Morrison Trust. Ladies and gentlemen, Sam said, cool as ever, let me walk you through some history. Preston stood, already trying to preempt the damage. We'll need documentation to support any claims made here, he barked. Sam simply smiled. Of course. We've prepared full documentation, county records, original deeds, and an unbroken chain of title. The next slide showed notarized paperwork. The Morrison Trust has held legal title to 847 acres, here since 1962, including most of the land this community occupies. At that moment, Eleanor Whippy rose from her usual seat in the back. That's correct, she said, her voice firm. I worked at the courthouse when that deal was made. I remember filing the paperwork. Biggest land purchase in the county. That year, 20-plus neighbors stared at the map like it was written in a language they'd never learned. Whitney sat frozen, her face as pale as the projector screen. Preston looked like someone had unplugged his confidence. Sam clicked to the next slide. A current map of Meadowbrook with color-coded lots. 23 of 30 were shaded in red. The legend read, Morrison Trust leased property. The trust owns the land beneath 76% of the homes here, Sam said evenly. These are leased to homeowners through Morrison Heritage Holdings. He clicked again. A list of addresses appeared, including the Hales. Preston shot up. This is impossible, his voice cracked. We reviewed every document. There was no mention of leases. Another click. Sam revealed the original 99-year leases, auto-renewing, binding. Most residents don't realize. Sam added, but legally, you're long-term tenants. Whitney looked like she might pass out when her own address appeared in red. Then Rick Davenport did the last thing I expected. He laughed loud, unapologetic laughter that broke the tension like glass. Well, I'll be damned, he said. BRE, I owe you an apology and probably 2 years' worth. Here I was, sneaking around buying eggs while pretending I backed. Whitney. Eleanor rose again, smiling that smile she used to scare people into honesty. Gray, she said sweetly, now might be a good time to mention the overdue rent we talked about. Sam nodded and flipped to a spreadsheet. For 5 years, the trust has absorbed maintenance costs and HOA fees. Outstanding rent and facility usage, $47,300. Silence, thick enough to taste. Whitney looked physically ill. Preston furiously scribbled notes. The rest sat stunned. Tommy Chun's parents, who'd once forbidden him from visiting my ranch, looked deeply uncomfortable. I stepped forward. Let me be clear. I'm not looking to evict anyone. That's not who we are. I looked around, catching eyes, meeting faces, but I am asking for the same respect I've always given this community. The trust has supported this neighborhood quietly for years, hosting events, maintaining land, funding improvements. Sam clicked to the final slide. Moving forward together. We offer 3 paths, he said. First, all current leases can continue under existing terms. Rent absorbed by the trust. Second, a portion of rental income will fund a formal community improvement fund. Third, all harassment of ranch operations must stop immediately. The ranch's use is legally grandfathered under historical land designations. Whitney finally spoke, barely audible. You mean, we're renting from you? I nodded. Morrison Heritage Holdings has managed your lease since you moved in. Rent, maintenance, everything. Preston dug through his briefcase, desperate to understand how he missed this. Eleanor stood one last time. "There's something else," she said, calm and clear. Gray's grandfather didn't buy this land to flip it. He bought it to protect it. He wanted the area to grow the right way with respect. The trust helped build this place and paid for more than it ever asked in return. Maybe it's time. Some of you remembered what being a neighbor actually means. The meeting didn't so much end as dissolve into chaotic conversations, some apologetic, some angry, all shaken. Whitney and Preston slipped out in silence, Preston already dialing what I assumed was his lawyer. Rick shook my hand with genuine humility. Several others who'd once kept their distance now seemed eager to fix that. As I packed up Sam's equipment, I couldn't help but feel the quiet satisfaction of justice done. Whitney Hail had spent months trying to evict me from land she didn't realize I owned. And now she knew. She'd been living on Morrison Trust property the whole time under my lease, on land my family's held since before she was born. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting the truth speak for itself. The week after our big reveal was nothing short of fascinating. In a town like Meadowbrook, news spreads faster than wildfire. By Saturday, everyone knew the juicy detail. The HOA president who tried to evict the local rancher had been renting her house from him. Cheryl Hawthorne, the blogger who once accused me of threatening community harmony, reached out for an updated article. She called it a correction and clarification piece. I declined. The facts had already spoken volumes. On Monday morning, Whitney Hail stepped down as HOA president. Her resignation letter cited personal matters and unresolved conflicts. Without acknowledging the embarrassment everyone else already knew. The board voted Eleanor Whitby in as interim president without hesitation. Her first act? Officially designating my ranch a heritage agricultural preserve, acknowledging its role in enhancing the community rather than harming it. Preston Hail showed up at my place on Wednesday. He brought with him not threats or legal jargon, but humility. The man on my porch that afternoon was a far cry from the bulldog lawyer I'd seen at meetings. "Gray," he said, "I owe you an apology. Whitney and I made assumptions and acted without knowing the full picture. I'd like to offer my legal services to the Morrison Trust pro bono. Call it community service. It was a smart move." Preston was a skilled attorney, despite his earlier missteps, and the trust had use for legal guidance. I agreed on one condition. His first assignment would be reviewing all HOA bylaws to ensure they respected both the trust's rights and the community's legal foundation. It took Whitney another week before she finally approached me again. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and I was working in my garden when she walked up, noticeably different. Gone were the stilettos and power suits. She wore jeans and a plain t-shirt. No legal papers, no agenda. Just a worn photo album in her hands. "I found something," she said softly, flipping it open to reveal black and white photos of a farm that looked an awful lot like mine. "My grandmother's, in Iowa. She grew up in a place like this." Her voice wavered. "I forgot that. I forgot a lot of things." She looked out over my vegetable beds, the chickens clucking quietly in the background. "Moving here, I thought success meant control standards, order, appearances. But those pictures reminded me what matters." We talked for over an hour. That conversation taught me more about Whitney than months of heated HOA meetings ever had. She'd spent her life climbing ladders, bigger homes, better jobs, more status. To her, the ranch symbolized a life she believed she had outgrown. But seeing her grandmother's photos had unearthed something she'd buried beneath ambition and suburbia. "I started a garden," she said as she stood to leave. "Just a little one behind the house. Preston thinks I've gone nuts, but there's something about dirt under your nails that feels honest At the edge of my property, she paused. For what it's worth, Gray, I'm sorry. Not just for the legal battle, but for trying to change something that never needed fixing. Tommy Chun began visiting again the next week. His parents had reconsidered their stance and decided that letting him help with the animals wasn't such a bad idea after all. Word got around. Soon, neighborhood kids began tagging along, curious to see real chickens, to understand where eggs came from. What began as casual visits turned into impromptu lessons. Eleanor suggested turning them into a structured community program. Meanwhile, the Morrison Trust officially launched the Community Improvement Fund Sam had proposed, using rental income to upgrade shared spaces, trails, and the community center. My ranch, once seen as a property value risk, became a draw-in amenity that families praised in real estate listings. Rip Davenport kept buying eggs. Then he started bringing friends, neighbors, co-workers, even city folks interested in farm-fresh produce and local agriculture. Slowly, my small-scale operation became exactly what Whitney had once feared, a legitimate, recognized agricultural business. But this time, it was embraced. Irony, as they say, has a sharp sense of humor. Eleanor stayed on as HO, a president, bringing steady leadership and much-needed memory of the town's roots. Under her guidance, HOA rules were rewritten not to enforce conformity, but to protect both homes and heritage. We'd finally found a balance between progress and preservation. 6 months later, I was in my garden again when I noticed Whitney. Across the street, knees deep in her own plot of vegetables. The rows were neat. The growth was healthy. When she caught me watching, she smiled and waved. I waved back. That simple exchange said everything about how far we'd come. From adversaries to neighbors. From opponents to participants in something bigger than ourselves. Community, it turns out, isn't about strict rules or matching fences. It's about coexisting with respect for people, history, and place. As I write this, nearly a year has passed since the day Whitney Hail stormed down my driveway in heels and a folder full of citations. She's still in the same house still, renting from the Morrison Trust, but she's different now. She understands that homeownership isn't just about lawns and square footage. It's about being part of something shared. A neighborhood with chickens, gardens, and stories that span generations. True satisfaction, I've learned, comes not from winning battles but from helping others realize they were fighting the wrong one all along. Whitney came to understand that honoring the past doesn't mean rejecting the future. And I came to understand that even our harshest critics can grow if given the right soil. The Morrison Trust still supports Meadowbrook. My ranch still offers eggs, lessons, and quiet purpose. And each morning, as I toss feed to my hens, I'm reminded of what home truly means. Not just a place but a promise, a responsibility, a story we all contribute to. If you've enjoyed this tale about how a power-hungry HOA president learned a valuable lesson, let me know in the comments. Do you think Whitney really changed, or is she plotting a quiet return? And remember, before starting a fight in your neighborhood, make sure you know who owns the land beneath your feet. You might just be picking a fight with your landlord.